Believe that, if you will. We look forward to a special.
Blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. Oh, what a foretaste of glory divine, heir of salvation, purchase of God, born of His Spirit, washed in His blood. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. Perfect submission, perfect delight, visions of rapture now burst from my sight. Angels descending, ring from above, echoes of mercy and whispers of love. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. Praising my Savior all the day long.
Amen. Been blessed today. In a certain backyard, there are two trees. One is a Bradford pear, and one is a pin oak. As spring began to bring forth new life after a long winter slumber, the fast-growing symmetrical pear blossomed into a beautiful shade tree. The oak, with its gnarly limbs, barely resembled the tree at all. Both trees will face blasting winds, scorching heat, and bitter cold. In the long run, the soft-wooded pear will succumb to the elements, while the hardy oak continues to grow. You know, most people would call this process life. Most people would call it nature. But we began a series last week about Joseph in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis. And we started at the end of his life. We started there, we considered Genesis 50 and Hebrews 11 there, the Faith Hall of Fame. The one thing that Joseph wanted, the one thing that Joseph is remembered for, in spite of all the great things that he did, in spite of the fact that in his day and time he was the second most powerful man in the world, the man that he is there, the thing that he's most noted for is his faith. And his faith was in a promise. Now we know the story there from Genesis, how they all wound up in Egypt there, and they stayed 400 years. But on Joseph's deathbed, and what you say on your deathbed is going to matter a lot as to your legacy and how you've lived your life. But the one thing that he wanted was for his bones to be taken to Canaan whenever Israel left Egypt. Now he didn't say, now I want you to take an entourage right now and go back to Canaan and bury my bones. He says, when you leave Egypt. He believed that God would keep the promises that he gave to his great-grandfather Abraham, that he would make of them a people whose descendants would be as the sands of the sea and the stars of the sky. So when Moses and Israel, when they left Egypt there, when they left Goshen, they took the bones of Joseph there in the sarcophagus or the coffin, whatever you want to call it. And then when they got into the land, they buried him at Shechem. So Joseph was known for his faith. He was known for his faith in the promise of God. Now Joseph was a great man. God would use him mightily. God would use him to save his people, the Hebrews. And he would use him to save the known world at that time. But the whole series here that we're going to be looking at in the next few weeks is God's molding process. Joseph wasn't ready to be used the way God wanted to use him when he was a teenager here, as we'll look at in just a few moments. None of the men and none of the people of God were ready to be used until God made them ready. Now, how does God get anybody ready to use them? Well, it's a molding process. And for all of us who have been saved, it's a sanctification process. Sanctification has been defined as God saving us over and over. A starting place being when we first came to Christ, and then a continual process throughout our lives. Now, and that, by the way, is called the taking on of holiness. How many are holy this morning? The Bible calls us holy, the saints holy. Do you feel holy? Do you and I consider ourselves to be holy? I don't. I consider myself to be anything but holy. God has to make us holy. God has to make us into that instrument that he wants to use for his glory. And without exception, all of your biblical characters, God had to mold and fashion. And that's called putting us through the fire. Peter said, count it not strange, this fiery trial that's come your way. Now, while the army challenges recruits to be all that you can be, the military has no interest in self-expression or rugged individualism. Probably that's why I wouldn't have made a very good soldier, but anyway. In fact, they have a remedy for those maladies called boot camp. And God has his own spiritual boot camp. And I think I'm still going through it. I'm not all that I can be, and I don't think if you were to tell the truth that you are all that God would have you to be as well. We're still going through God's boot camp. Now, spiritually, we have a set of values that God wants to change. He desires that our sense of self-worth and security flow from our relationship to to Him. Now we may think, even if we've been saved a lot of years, and most of us in here have, we may think, well, I'm exactly where I need to be. God don't have to do anything more to me. I've already been through enough of the fire and enough of the trials that I've already arrived. I got news for you. I haven't arrived yet. God still has to put me through the fire. And I've been through the fire. And I'm going through the fire. I think old Johnny Cash didn't used to sing a song called "A Burning Ring of Fire." Well, gold, in order to be purified, has to go through the fire. And if God, the man or woman that God wants to use, He'll put them through the fire. He'll take the impurities out. He'll substitute, take out the bad stuff and put in His grace and holiness. That's the only way that you and I could ever be holy this morning. It's the only way that you and I could ever be righteous, rather, is to take on His holiness and righteousness. Now, sometimes our will and our values will clash with the Lord's. Sometimes we can be hard-headed. I'm hard-headed. I'm a Bernard. I'm from the mountains. And I'm hard-headed. My cousin back there too, he's the same way. Sometimes God has to begin a process of breaking our wills to conform to His. Not always a pleasant experience, but if God's going to use you and I this morning, He's going to break us. Now, first of all, God intends to remove our dependencies. Now, turn back there, if you will, to Genesis 37 and look at 33 through 36. Joseph there was captured. We read those verses. And he knew it and said, "It is my son's cold and evil beast hath devoured him. Joseph is without doubt rent in pieces." And Jacob rent his clothes and put sackcloth upon his loins and mourned for his son many days. And all his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, "For I will go down into the grave into my son mourning." Thus his father wept for him. And the Midianites sold him into Egypt unto Potiphar, an official of Pharaoh's and captain of the guard. Now, relationships there. The Joseph couldn't turn to his family. Roughly from age 17 to 30, he was in Egypt. He would be separated from his family. And everyone and everything that he loved and was familiar with him. F.B. Meyer agrees. And with tender heart for this lonely lad, he writes, how eager his desire to send just one last message to his father. And with all these thoughts, there would mingle a wondering thought of the great God whom he had learned to worship. What would he say to this? Little did he think then that hereafter he should look back on that day as one of the most gracious links in a chain of loving providences, or that he should ever say, "Be not grieved or angry with yourselves. God did send me here before you." It is very sweet as life passes by to be able to look back on dark and mysterious events and to trace the hand of God where we once saw only the malice and cruelty of man. Now God here will teach Joseph. And he's a young man. He's 17 years old. He's young. He's naive. He's very immature. He is the favorite, spoiled son of his daddy Jacob, because Jacob's wife, Rachel, he loved the most. and she would be lost in childbearing when his younger son, or younger brother Benjamin, was born. But there's some interesting things there in the verses that we first read, 37, 5 through 10. You know, Jacob, he sent Joseph out to look for his brothers in Shechem, where their animals were pastured. You know, in that days it was like the Bedouins today. And this was the very place where their sister Diana, she had been raped, and where they had killed all the men and raided their homes and property. So, given this, Jacob sends a party out, you know, to check on Joseph. He ordered rather Joseph to go to check on his brothers and to report back. So Joseph, he obeyed his father's wishes. He went to Dothan and found his brothers. And as soon as his brothers saw him coming, their immediate reaction was, "It's the dreamer. Let's kill him." They hated their brother. They were jealous of their brother. Why? Because he told them a dream. He said, in essence, y'all are going to bow down and pay homage to me and worship me. You know. And they did there toward the end of Genesis. So actually he was given prophecy. But who wants to hear a 17-year-old brat come out and say to the rest of his brothers who hated him, who hated his guts, saying, "Now you boys are going to fall down and worship me." Oh, they hated him. They said, "Let's kill the dreamer." And they really did want there to kill him. And to add insult to injury, the coat that Joseph was wearing was like waving a red flag in front of a bull. If you've ever seen the bull fighters, that red cape or a flag, Toro, 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 and that bull will come rushing. Well, when he showed him that coat that his father gave him because it was his favorite, whoa, that really was all that they could take. It's the dreamer. Let's kill him. They hated that coat because it set them apart from you. Sibling rivalry. Brothers or sisters, and we're all brothers or sisters unless we're only children. You ever had a sibling rivalry? Have you ever had a brother or sister that outperformed you? Have you ever had a brother or sister who the mother or daddy seemed to play favorites? Sure, we all have had that. Every one of us. And it was the same here. Because Benjamin and Joseph was Jacob's two favorites. And the rest of them, through other women, through Leah, through, I guess, their concubines, they hated. They wanted rid of. So they captured him. They finally captured him and they said, "Let's kill him." But the eldest brother Reuben, he had some sound judgment. And Reuben there had lost his position as firstborn because he had slept with his father's concubine. But he stands in a good light here. Reuben suggested that they not kill him, but to bind him and throw him into a pit. And Reuben wanted to come back later and rescue Joseph. So the brothers there, they sold Joseph to the Midianites for 20 shekels of silver. Then they killed a kid of the goats and then took Joseph's beautiful coat of many colors and used the blood on the coat. Now this matter of deceiving, now this goes back. You go back a piece in Genesis. And Jacob's mother, Rebekah, well, they did the same thing. Old man Isaac was on his deathbed, and he was about ready to pronounce the blessing there to the eldest son. And by the way, in those days, that really did matter more or the birthright, that mattered more than it does today. But they deceived him. You see, again, going back to favorites, Jacob was a mama's boy. He was his mama's favorite. He loved more of the indoor things, the cooking and all of that. While Esau was daddy's boy, he was a hunter. And so they got a skin there of one of the animals, and they took some of the kid there, venison, and put it into the hands and arms of Jacob to deceive Isaac. So they deceived poor old blind Isaac. And eventually, Jacob would go in there and disguise his voice, and he would get the birthright. Actually, further back, he swindled it from Esau. Esau was out hunting one day, and he'd come in, and he said, "Boy, I sure am hungry." And Jacob was making up a good pot of pottage or soup. And Esau said, "Boy, I sure would like to have some of that soup." Jacob said, "How bad do you want it? Would you give me your birthright?" Old Esau, only thinking about his stomach, gave it to Jacob. He said, "Who cares about a birthright as long as I'm about to starve to death?" So old Jacob there, and this trickery and this deceitfulness there would force Jacob to have to leave and go to Rebekah's brother Laban. And you could read the story there. Laban was a worse, probably, trickster than Jacob. And he tricked him. He had to work, I think, 14 years for the hand of Rachel. So you see the trickery there. But we see there another thing about Joseph. If you will, turn to Genesis 39, and we don't want to get too far ahead on this. This is another message. But let's look at Genesis 39, 13 through 20. Now this is Potiphar's wife here. "And it came to pass, when she saw he had left his garment in her hand and was fled forth, that she called unto the man of her house and spake unto them, saying, See, he hath brought in a Hebrew unto us to mock us. He came in unto me to lie with me, and I cried with a loud voice. And it came to pass, when he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled and got him out. And she laid up his garment by her until his Lord came home. And she spake unto him according to these words, saying, The Hebrew servant which thou hast brought unto us came in unto me to mock me. And it came to pass, as I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me, and he fled out. And it came to pass, when his master heard the words of his wife, which he spake unto him, saying, After this did thy servant to me, that his wrath was kindled. Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in prison. So we'll say just a few things here. Joseph was, we'd say, a pretty good-looking man. And here he was in his boss's wife's house doing his duty. He was doing what he was supposed to be doing. And she looked at him and desired him, and over, and day after day, he was under temptation, to have relations with her. And he didn't. He stood firm against temptation. Well, she set him up. He noticed there was no one in the house there, and she wanted to get Joseph in the house there. She made her move. She went beyond her verbal advances, physically grabbed a hold of Joseph, She held on him so tightly that when he jerked away, part of the garment went. So then she says, "Help, somebody, this man's in here." And she cried rape. And poor Joseph, bless his heart, went back to prison. Now, we would say, I think he spent up to 2 years in prison. Woe unto poor old Joseph. What's he doing in prison? What's a good man? A man that didn't do anything, what's he doing in prison? Well, God had a reason for Joseph being in prison. God had a reason for every circumstance that happened to Joseph. God has had a reason there for his brothers capturing him, throwing him in the pit, the slave traders, the Midianites coming and selling him into slavery there into Egypt. God had a plan in everything that happened in Joseph's life. I believe that today the sovereign Lord has a purpose and a plan for everything that happens to us. Now we may not see the reason why, especially if we're going through trials and temptations and all of these things, all of the rough times. God has a reason for it. God's trying to make us. God's trying to mold us. Remember the potter there. The lump of clay on the wheel. And how the great potter, God, forms and makes that lump of clay into something beautiful. If you've ever seen a potter, I've seen it on television, how the process, how they'll mold, the wheel will be turning, how they'll mold the clay, and then they've got to put it into the oven, and then they'll paint it, the designs on it, and whatever. There's a lesson there. Even the clay, natural clay, has to go through the fire. And we, as God's clay, as God's instruments, have to go through the fire. Well, we'll come back to this just a little bit later in the series. Secondly, God intends to make us spiritual. Our relationship to God takes priority over all others. Notice, if you will, chapter 41, let's look at 41, 38, and 39. 41, 38, and 39. And Pharaoh said unto his servants, "Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom the Spirit of God is?" And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, "Forasmuch as God hath showed thee all this, there is none so discreet and wise as thou art." So we're jumping forward here. Joseph made second in command in all Egypt. He's the manager, overseer of the granaries in the times of famine. And even though Joseph gave Pharaoh the guidelines of what kind of man he needed, he never once said, "I'd like to have the job." Joseph wasn't looking for a job. God put Joseph there where Pharaoh could find him. Pharaoh noticed his spirituality and his wisdom, and he said, "There's not another man like him." Now, I don't think, well, I know that Pharaoh, if he could have seen Joseph as a 17 or 18-year-old boy, wet under the ears, would have said, "Wow, what wisdom." He would have said, "Well, that young whippersnapper, what does he think he knows?" Point is, Joseph there stood right before him. He met all the requirements. But even then, when it seemed appropriate for Joseph to volunteer, he restrained. But the king knew that Joseph was the right man for the job. You know, God's reputation takes priority over my will and your will. Look at 45 verse 8, chapter 45, verse 8. So now it was not you that sent me hither, but God, and he hath made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. Had a great reputation here. And here Joseph will reveal himself to his brothers. And you could say he might have deceived them a little bit there. And but he couldn't have done probably what he should have done to them. Now that's man's way of looking at it. Man would say, get back at them. They sold you into slavery. You've been in jail. You've been falsely accused and all this. Get back at them. He didn't do that. He forgave. And that shows there a lesson about forgiveness. But another lesson, he says, you thought you were doing evil to me. But I'll tell you, it was God who worked outside your evil intentions to preserve life. God even used the bad things there that happened to Joseph, the evil things. God will use evil. God allows evil today in this world. He will use it for his purposes. The divine purposes, the divine sovereign purposes of God will be accomplished. So God's plan takes priority over mine. Now, you know, in boot camp, and the purpose of boot camp is to see how you react under pressure. Some don't make it through boot camp. But others, some, you know, become callous during the process. They become bitter. But others there, however, learn to conform to the person that God desires for them to become. So this morning in the molding process called life, not always fun to be in the fire, but God has a reason for it.